So welcome to the Climate Emergency Overview and Scrutiny Committee. The role of Overview and Scrutiny is to provide independent, critical friend challenge and to work with the Council's executive and other public service providers for the benefit of the public. The committee considers submissions from a range of sources and reaches conclusions based on the weight of evidence, not on party political grounds. Okay, we've had apologies from Alex Freeney, and he was going to send a sub, but she's ill. That's Sarah Bell, and she sent apologies too. Now, the minutes of the previous meeting. Has anyone got any comments on the minutes? Yes, Peter.
I asked the question about the location of the two other solar farms, and the minutes don't name them. I'm just trying to scan through the separate document.
Okay, have you seen the answers to the questions that we were sent by email?
I have, but I can't see a single line saying site 2 is at X and site.
I think it's still secret, isn't it? Doesn't it say that?
So yes, the two sites haven't been named yet, but we will promise more information when it comes here in January.
Okay. It talks about SCN being consulted about the sites. Presumably they know where they are before councillors do, which I don't think is acceptable. So I'd like to know, even if it has to be a part 2, where these sites are.
Sorry, it says what?
We can take that up outside the meeting, but I think the minute is accurate because there was no information provided at the meeting.
Okay, are we all happy with the actual minutes then?
Catherine, there's a typo on page 7. Just it's quite entertaining. Percentage of homes insulted, not insulated, but.
Neil was hoping that no one would draw attention to that.
Sorry.
But he had spotted it. Okay, can we have a show of hands for accepting the minutes? You weren't there, right? They were. Okay, great. Right. Any declarations of interest? Nope. Are there any questions?
No public questions and no member questions, Chair.
Good. Right, so on to item 16, Climate Emergency Action Plan, Transport Actions. And I think Paul is going to give us a very brief overview to this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. Apologies I can't be with you tonight. I'm still feeling very unwell. So just a brief introduction from me. Transport is a very important part of the climate emergency plan, and the actions are projected to deliver 45% of the carbon savings up to 2030. Transport carbon savings are the largest across the priority areas in the action plan, and for this evening this item is a deep dive into the transport sector of the action plan, and your comments would be welcome. It's then planned to present the Climate Emergency Action Plan to Council on the 24th of October 2024. We have a lot of transport items to get through this evening, so the plan is that each officer will provide a short brief for each section, and starting with Sophia, who will commence with electric vehicles. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul, and thank you very much for coming, even though you don't feel well. I hope you're feeling better soon.
Thank you.
Okay, Sophia.
Yeah, hi everyone. Shall I go through the presentation? Is it okay if I share my screen then?
Yes.
I believe you can see the screen, isn't it? Okay, nice. My name is Sofia Haralabidou. I'm a Transport Planning Officer at Wokingham Borough Council, and I'm delighted to run through a short presentation on the consultation draft of the Wokingham Borough EV charging strategy. This is a similar presentation to that given at the Customer Community Overview and Scrutiny meeting on 8th July 2024. First of all, I want to touch base on the need for developing this strategy. The Department for Transport has announced that it is looking to introduce a statutory duty for local authorities to have local EV charging strategies. In its response to the Future of Transport Zero Emission Vehicles consultation, DFT mentioned that they will update local transport plans to include the need for local authorities to produce EV charging strategies, and therefore this strategy will be one of the supporting documents of our emerging local transport plan 4. Nationally, the UK government has committed to end the sale of new petrol and diesel cars by 2035 in an effort to decarbonise road vehicles and achieve net zero emissions by 2050. To facilitate the phase-out of internal combustion engine vehicles, the government developed a zero-emission vehicle mandate, ZEV mandate, requiring manufacturers to sell an increasing proportion of EVs each year. These sales targets were introduced in January 2024 and will gradually increase every year until they reach 100 until 2035. At a local level, in July 2019, Wokingham Borough Council declared a climate emergency and is committed to playing as full a role as possible, leading by example as well as by exhortation, in achieving a carbon-neutral borough by 2030. Transport is the second largest contributor following the domestic sector to the borough's carbon emissions, responsible for 31.2% in 2020. Internal combustion engine vehicles are a leading cause of transport emissions, and so electric vehicles have a key role to play in reducing greenhouse gases, improving air quality, and tackling climate change. While this plan focuses on the switch from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles, it is important that electric vehicle infrastructure is seen as part of a much wider sustainable transport strategy, which emphasizes the benefits of active travel, meaning walking, cycling, and wheeling for shorter journeys, and the use of public transport. Simply switching of vehicles from internal combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles will not solve issues around congestion or public health. This is emphasized by our emerging local transport plan 4, which provides further actions around non-EV related activity. Here we present the main content of our EV charging strategy. The strategy clarifies the rationale for its development and sets out where we are now in providing charging for cars across our borough, our charging needs by 2030, and how this can be met. The strategy lays out the role of the Council in meeting this demand and presents our vision along with an action plan for the rollout of EV charging infrastructure by 2030. Through this strategy, the Council will enable the delivery of electric vehicle infrastructure ahead of need, which will prevent lack of suitable charge points being a barrier to some users. This will ensure a just transition, addressing market failure, but making sure that the less commercially attractive yet important sites are appropriately equipped and drive best practice. Our main principle is to ensure that the right charge point of the right power is installed in the right place for the right users. In doing so, we will continue engaging with residents, businesses, and private sector, establishing a thriving public charge point network across our borough. Some of the evidence-based work strategy does is output this graph, which shows that by 2033, we are forecasting there will be more EVs on the road in Wokingham Borough than petrol and diesel vehicles. This increase and subsequent decrease in internal combustion engine vehicles could lead to approximately 12% decrease in carbon dioxide emissions in the borough, from nearly 152,000 tonnes in 2020 to around 133,000 tonnes by 2030. The EV charge point forecast model considers three scenarios, low, mid, and high, with each representing a different ratio of EVs to charge point. According to the high scenario, by 2030 there is a forecast need of 1,392 fast charging sockets and 320 rapid charging sockets. In this case, fast refers to AC charges between 7 kilowatt speed, more commonly as standard, and 22 kilowatt speed, which more commonly referred as fast, whilst rapid refers to DC charges with speeds greater than 50 kilowatt. We can see that those numbers are quite high. However, we recognize that the private sector is expected to significantly contribute towards meeting these totals. This is already happening, or it will continue, it's inevitable, but the local authority will need to particularly intervene where the private sector doesn't wish to invest in order to ensure an equitable rollout and to meet the demand for charge points infrastructure. Here we can see a summary of the vision and the 11 objectives that we have developed for the strategy. By 2030, we must have in place a comprehensive and inclusive charge point network, one that our residents, businesses and visitors can trust and they are confident using. Our vision is to support the rollout of public EV charge points, catering for any existing and future EV demand, whilst facilitating zero-emission trips that can't otherwise be made by sustainable transport modes. The areas where intervention will focus on are guided by a couple of maps. So this map shows where higher EV uptake is forecast, and clearly where people have lower access to off-street parking, that's where there might be a need for the public sector to intervene. At this point, it's worth highlighting that the last couple of years, we were successful in bidding for government grants. We secured funding through the on-street residential charge point scheme and the subsequent local electric vehicle infrastructure scheme, otherwise known as LEVI. Both schemes are targeting residential areas where residents don't have off-street parking and they are more likely to rely on public charge points to cover their needs. Also, we have set up a process so that residents who lack off-street parking can directly email us and request a public charge point near to where they live. And these requests are taken into consideration when identifying suitable locations. It is worth mentioning that the draft EV charging strategy has been reviewed and updated following comments from officers, relevant members, and energy saving trust specialists. Once the final strategy is adopted, it will remain a live document and will be reviewed regularly as technology advances and new national policies and funding streams are brought forward. Regarding the next steps, our plan is to go out to public consultation this week. The consultation will stay open for around a month, and following the end of the consultation, all comments and feedback received will be taken on board, and the draft strategy will be updated. The refined version will be presented at the executive meeting either late autumn 2024 or, considering that we are already at the end of September, it's more likely to be in January 2025. So I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Okay, have we got any questions? Adrian.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Sophia. A few questions on what was quite a detailed presentation, which we went through quite quickly. Do we know to what extent the availability of EV charging is constraining uptake of EVs at the moment?
There are different surveys that have been undertaken regarding the barriers to prevent EV adoption. Actually, the Council conducted one of these surveys a couple of years ago. Initially, a couple of years ago, the main barriers were priced cost of electric vehicles, charging anxiety. Quite a few of the residents were unaware of the technology around EVs, but nowadays things has changed. For example, we can see that there are some models like the Vauxhall Frontera that they reach price parity between the petrol and electric models. the range of the vehicles has increased. There are models with more than 400 plus range. So one of the main barriers is still charging infrastructure. To overcome this barrier, as I mentioned earlier, we are looking at all available government funds and apply where possible. We secured nearly 74,000 2 years ago through the on-street residential charge point scheme and install a number of charge points within the borough. And earlier in the spring, we submitted and we were successful to our local electric vehicle infrastructure scheme. So in the next couple of years, we will see a ramp up in the installation of residential charge points. So yeah, we're trying our best to overcome this barrier.
Thank you. I've got a few more. Shall I keep going? Yep, thank you. One of the slides you showed had bar charts, which I think were high, medium and low forecast for the number of charge points required. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, that's true. And if you can go through the charging strategy, it's 3 different scenarios, and they are all related to the number of cars that can charge from a charge point. But you can find further details into the EV charging strategy.
I might need to read that a bit more carefully. Sorry. You talked about getting the private sector involved to bear some of the risk and presumably cover some of the investment. How does that work in practice with what we're doing at the moment?
That's something that has been emphasized by the government. This is the guidance that has been given. And to be honest, it makes more sense. The private sector has the knowledge and the expertise to help us with the rollout of charge points. However, private sector tend to focus on commercially attractive locations, which that makes sense because they invest, so they want to recoup their investment. By using though concession models or by using government funds, we can leverage private investments and then maximize the number of charge points that we can install in the borough. This is one of the commercial arrangements that we are considering. And another option is fully funded models. Especially because due to the financial challenges that the council is facing, it is a good opportunity to increase the charge point provision without this impacting on our internal resources.
Okay, and then final question. There's been some alarmist coverage in the media recently about the cost of charging at public charging points now exceeding the cost of buying petrol. How do we monitor or control the cost of using the charge points that we're installing? Do we have any leverage over that? Who actually sets that rate?
To be honest, that depends on the approach or the commercial model that we are following. If the private sector is putting more of the investment, they would like to have more control. However, our role is to have an equitable charge point network and one that is inclusive and try to actually, as you mentioned, drive parity between home charging and public charging. As you can see, the average cost according to ZapMap to charge on a charge point is 56p per kilowatt hour, and in Wokingham we have most of the charge points are either 47p per kilowatt hour or 55, which is lower than the average nationally. One way of controlling prices is we are asking, actually following a benchmarking approach, we are asking the suppliers to provide information around the whole energy price, how much they are buying the electricity, what is the margin, and then what are similar prices, what are the prices that other operators are charging for similar capacity charge points. In that way, we're trying to be consistent across our region and try to reduce prices as much as possible.
Okay, thank you.
That's it. Peter.
Thank you. I've got a few, if you'll indulge me. Our car charging in council-owned car parks. The aspiration was to have, where feasible, at least one fast or rapid charge point by 2030, which to me struck me as very unchallenging and a missed opportunity. We own the car parks, we own the land. We should be filling our car parks with fast or rapid charge points, not one. And even the one, as the asterisk said, if the car parks are close together, they'll share one. So I think we need to work much harder with getting charging points in our car parks. So how can we do that?
Just to emphasize that this is this makes reference to fast or rapid charge points, and we can also, and it depends on a case-by-case basis. Some locations might have a higher demand than others, so we will monitor demand and act accordingly. Also recently, Senex and in collaboration with their partners, they developed a tool where it helps local authorities and stakeholders understand and forecast the demand of EV charge point at each car park. So by using this tool, we can get better insights on the actual needs that we need to meet at each car park.
That's useful, but earlier in your presentation you said we should be leading. We should be providing infrastructure now so that people can go for the electric vehicle option earlier rather than waiting for to get the car first and we put the infrastructure. So we should be putting this in advance of those figures coming through. So I'd like to see a much more ambitious target for council-owned car park charge points.
It's finding the right balance. We can just install charge points that they stay unutilized, and they need more maintenance, and it will be harder and to incentivize the suppliers to maintain. So by having one rapid charge point and then installing some slow or standard charge points, we can cover the needs of the residents. But as I said, it depends on a case by case. We can't just say that we're going to install 10 or 15 or as many as possible in all the car parks. That needs to be a rationale for each case.
Is there not also a problem of if they're not being used, then other people can't be parking in those places? So they're just dead parking places. So probably depends on the sort of uptake of cars in the borough as a whole.
Again, and not all charge points are next to EV dedicated bays. We can monitor demand, and initially we can have some hybrid bays that can be used by either internal combustion engine vehicles and electric vehicles, and then when demand is high, we can turn them into EV dedicated space.
Okay, thanks. Peter, you've got more questions.
Yeah, hopefully get to a point where there's no distinction between a bay and a charging bay. There will be 100% coverage. Next one. So I was doing some maths here, trying to get through the numbers for the on-street car park charging points. So by 2030, we're looking for an uptake of 30,000 electric vehicles, with a 32% of those owned by people who have no drives or garage to charge them in, which will give us a target of 10,000 off-street parking charging points. And we're going for 780. Sorry, on street. That's on street. My apologies. So 10,000 charging points, on street charging points for these residents to use, and we're going for 783, which is great, but obviously we need to do more between now and 2030 if we're going to meet demand for on-street charging.
So, but you don't need a charger point for every car.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We're making the assumption that there's alternative charging facilities for those electric vehicles. So either at work or council car park.
Not necessarily. So something. Sorry, but I think this is quite pertinent to what you're saying there. So I've got some other comments or questions as well, but something that I was looking at today is actually community charging. So today I've signed up so that local people can come and use my charging point. So I've had an electric car for a year and a half now, and I have never charged within a 100-mile radius of home. I have a driveway, so obviously that reflects a large proportion, but not all residents. But there's a few companies. This one called Co-Charger is partnered with people like Octopus. So I've registered my charging portal for neighbours to use. So if there's someone else living in Charleville who doesn't have off-street parking or doesn't have a charger, they can come on and request to use my charging portal. So I guess I think we need to be really careful that in keeping pace, because I guess the risk is we invest in a lot of public charging infrastructure in the rapid and fast, which I think will be mainly used by visitors to the borough, not by residents, which is no bad thing if we're attracting business and visitors and so on. But I think it's a bit of a false economy that when even a public charger at 45 pence, that's 9 times my overnight rate that I get charged. So for residents, the vast majority of charging, I think, will and has to happen at home. So by using things like community charging, we can actually spread thousands and thousands of charge points across the borough because it's the places in everyone's home. So perhaps that's something that we as the council can be helping to promote while looking at, in terms of what's within our control. One of the other things is charging gullies. Just because when we're looking at just transition and relative economies, if the overnight rates just beat everything else by such a long way, and that's what makes an EV so much cheaper to run. If you're doing it at, I think probably the 45 pence, 50 pence works out a bit cheaper than petrol currently, but not that much. And yes, if you're doing a rapid charge at 75 pence, it's about the same. It's when you're charging at 7 pence overnight, which I'd say has been about 98% of all the charging we've ever done on our car in 18 months. I think that's what we will drive the uptake and obviously lower residents' bills.
Catherine is absolutely right, and I completely agree with her. There are schemes and providers like the Co-Charger where you can use somebody else's charge point, and we encourage residents and users to do so. Also, where people have access to off-street parking, we encourage them to install a home charger, which is the cheapest and easier solution. And as I emphasized earlier, our aim is to just make sure that we put the right charge point at the right location. For example, in residential areas, we will probably need standard or low charge points where dwell times are longer and tariffs can be lower. And also another option is the EV cable gullies or cross pavement solutions. We're engaging with other officers from councils who have trialed this equipment or these devices, and we're waiting to see for the government guidance that is going to be released next month before we proceed further.
Thank you.
Sorry, I've got a few more.
More from Peter.
Just to prove I've read the agenda. So going back to the 783 that I think we got funding for on-street charging. According to, again, my calculations, we've got around about 1,000 people with electric vehicles who have no drive or garage.
Peter, just to clarify that it's 783 additional charging points, is not the total number. And the funding we receive is not for that amount. Our aim is to go out to open tender and identify the supplier who will maximize the number of charge points installed in the borough. However, we are not sure at this stage how much funding the suppliers are willing to invest. As a worst case scenario, it might be a 50% funding, like a match funding, similar to the org scheme, but a more ambitious scenario is just to provide 90% of the funding.
Very good. So whatever number we come to in terms of the number of charge points, roughly 1,000 people currently, if we're taking 3,000 vehicles, 32% don't have a drive or a garage. We're looking around about 1,000 people who would benefit from a on-street charge point, and we have 783 of them. Are we going to be, talking to residents and saying, do you want a charge point outside your house because you've got an electric vehicle, or are we just going to randomly drop them across the bar? I know there are areas you highlighted, but there seems to be there's people with an EV and they need a charging point. Are we going to engage with those people to locate the charge points near where they live, or are we not going to do that? Because I think it makes sense to me in my head to go, if you've got a demand and those people need a charge point, then we should talk to them about it.
Yeah, to clarify, the figures that I presented earlier in the presentation are the forecasts, the total forecast, including the role of those that the council can support or the public sector can support, and the ones that can be covered by the private sector as well. So within the EV charging strategy, we also have a some different charts emphasizing on the public charge points, those that not the public, the ones that the public sector should support. We don't put randomly the charge points on the ground. We are already engaging with the residents. As I mentioned earlier, a couple of years ago, we have done we ran engagement and public consultation, trying to understand the barriers that prevent people from charging, or where would they like to see the charge points. Residents and who have access to off-street parking, the best way forward is for them to install a home charger, because they can have access to very low charging rates. And especially providers like Octabolts can give them access to something like 7p per kilowatt hour. And for those who don't have off-street parking, they can email us. We have dedicated a specific inbox, and they can send us the request for a public charge point near their properties. These requests are taken into consideration. We took this into consideration when we identified the org charge points, and the same we are still doing with the Levi charge points. Other criteria that are also taken into consideration is location of existing charge points. Our aim is that residents will be in 5-minute walk area from a public charge point. Also, footway widths. Some of the footways are quite narrow, so we don't want to create barriers or reduce add on the street clutter. Lighting is another criteria. Well lit areas make users feel more safe. And the most important is also proximity to the electrical connection network.
For these charges, we make sure that they are, some people say intelligent, but can support things like vehicle to grid, so that we have chargers which are bidirectional. We mandate this as part of the requirements, because we should. I mean, I went to a seminar about EV last week from an expert in the field, and one of the problems is people get home from work, 5 o'clock, they plug their EV in for charging just at the time when peak demand on the electricity network comes in. So people are charging their cars just when you don't want to be draining the electricity network. So with the kind of smart chargers, you plug them in and they don't charge until the electricity network says you can charge them at 3 o'clock in the morning, whatever. But also with vehicle to grid systems, they can pull charge out of your vehicle to a certain level, and obviously it's not going to drain it completely. So we should be making sure that we mandate whatever these charging points are, that they can do, that sort of intelligent charging rather than just a dumb charger, because otherwise in a few years' time we're going to have to be upgrading them.
Yeah, the ones that you are referring, I believe, are the home chargers, which makes more sense. We're following the government guidance and the regulations that were introduced in 2023 last year. So load balancing is one of the requirements. Passive infrastructure or future-proofing the EVI is another one. So, and we are also engaging with our DNO, which is South SSCN, to make sure that there won't be any constraints in the sites that we identify, or at least to make them aware of the future or upcoming projects.
Sorry, when we're talking to when we're going out to tender, are we going to mandate that the chargers can do vehicle to grid?
No, vehicle to grid is not something that has been mandated, will be mandated in the specification.
What about the intelligent charging, so overnight charging?
Yeah, smart charging and off-peak tariffs, it is included in that.
Okay, thank you.
And Sophia, just sorry, on those sort of, Peter, are you referring there to the ones in the WBC car parks and therefore the ones that we're kind of asking people to install?
No, it's a general question. Okay. So because of the nature of the change in generation and demand, we need to be mindful of distributed battery storage. Electric vehicles are an ideal distributed battery storage, but they only work when you have the chargers that support vehicle to grid.
Yeah.
And also the right vehicle as well, because it's not only about the EVI, it's also about the vehicles as well. Not all vehicles support the vehicle to grid, but I believe this makes more sense.
At the moment, you're right, but we should be, like you said earlier, we should be putting infrastructure in now that supports the future. We shouldn't be, there are limited vehicles at the moment that support vehicle to grid, but there'll be more that'll come through. So we should have the infrastructure ready to support those, to encourage people to buy those vehicles, because it's in their own interest.
That's right, but I still believe that this is more appropriate to home chargers rather than the public chargers, because this functionality is most useful to residents who have home chargers and therefore can utilize the electricity from their vehicles to get energy in their houses, rather than the public ones in the car park or in residential areas.
Okay, thanks. Caroline.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you. Catherine also mentioned what I was going to do, but can I ask about commercial vehicles? Because where I live, there's an awful lot of commercial vehicles coming home at night. Are we talking to businesses to ask them to charge in their commercial businesses rather than have the home car and the van at home, which obviously I presume takes longer to charge? Thank you.
So businesses that they charge at their depots or at their premises, they should use grants like the workplace scheme to install charge points. But there are a lot of van drivers that actually take their vehicles at home. So we need to make sure that these areas are equipped with a right charge point to help them cover their charging needs. As far as I know, the climate emergency team have been engaging with businesses, running a number of webinars with the support of Energy Saving Trust, and engaging with businesses, promoting the available grants. And we are also in discussions with our neighboring authorities, and we are thinking of arranging a Let's Experience electric event targeting businesses, so that we are better placed to understand their needs and make them aware of how they can switch to EVs and the EV infrastructure that they need to deploy.
Thank you.
Has anyone else got any? Moses.
Okay, I wanted to ask on the 2035 date for all new cars, light vans, and vehicles to be zero emission. Is that still in line with the new government date?
Sorry, can you repeat your question? Because
okay, my understanding is the Labour government is intending to change the 2035 to 2030.
That hasn't changed yet. So according to now, the date that we know is 2035. There are some discussions, but this hasn't changed yet.
Okay.
But our strategy, as you can see, it's for 2030, and like our forecast is up to 2030 when we envisage to become carbon neutral, or where we want to.
So you gave a presentation about EV strategy. I see a lot of what and why, but I can't see the how. And you seem to be answering the hows in responding to the questions asked. Is there an EV strategy document that contains the hows, how to arrive at this destination, the things we want to achieve?
The EV charging strategy that I have circulated is the summarized version, is the more public-faced document that we're going to use to go out to public consultation. There is a more detailed and technical version that initially was drafted, and I'm happy to share this, if you think that would be useful to you. It's just feedback we received from the Energy Saving Trust, was that we need to use a more summarized version so that it's easier for the residents to understand and respond. As for the how, as I mentioned, two are the commercial models that we are considering. These are included and in the summarized version and in more details in the longer version. One is the concession contracts, so we can leverage, we can use government funding and then try to leverage private investments, and then fully funded models where all the capital is of the investment is covered by the service providers. As to the areas, there are a couple of maps that can help us understand where the need is forecasted. The detailed version also presents includes more details about the figures or the forecast numbers for the EVs and the EV charge points required.
Maybe I'm not coming across. You provide a lot of answers to the questions. I would have thought there would be a single document that explains to people, because like there's mention of about communal charging. Where's the document that says how would that work? That somebody can look at and say, okay, this is how the council intends to approach this kind of charging. Because you provide a lot of answers here. The question I'm asking is there a document where those answers are? Because you've done a presentation on EV strategy. Right. Okay.
So this was emailed around before.
The PowerPoint.
No, the charging strategy.
Right. I think.
So the EV charging strategy is included in the agenda, if I'm not mistaken. So you should have access to this. It's
to us before the meeting.
Was it?
Yeah.
But
check my email.
If you want some more technical questions, we have in the more detailed version, which is around 200 pages. But this wouldn't be easy and for you to read and for the residents, hence we developed this summary version.
I don't want 200-page document. Okay,
I guess
final
so.
question. Final
Moses,
yeah.
have you read this?
I don't know whether I have a copy of that. I'll check my email.
This is in the agenda. It's in the PDF as well.
I have the PowerPoint. I don't think I have that. I'll check. Don't worry. Okay, my final question then is the RAG rating. What is the basis for the RAG rating? I'm trying to understand how you get amber, green, and red. So if I look at page 23, for example, I see number 70735 tons of equivalent carbon, and I see amber. So how do we get those RAG rating?
This is something that I think Andrew is better placed to answer because
Sophia,
he's the one.
Yeah, I'm here. So we do at the start of the CAP, we do have a paragraph saying how we rag them. So green we see as on track and going to hit with that with the date within the CAP. Then red is where there's potential risk to delivery of the date that we've got within the CAP, and then amber is potential. There could be issues that arise, but not as kind of we see it as not as severe as the ones that are rated red. So
if I take a specific page on the transport actions, page 23, and I see 4121 tons of equivalent carbon, and it says amber, what does that mean? Does that mean we are 50% there, or?
Yeah.
Page 23.
So yeah, I mean, Barry is correct that that's what the RAG is for. The RAG isn't relating to the carbon saving. I know they're next to each other, but the RAG is for the action as a whole. The carbon saving is what is expected to be achieved by 2030. So, and the RAG is how far we are along with the action. So not all the actions will be delivered per year. It'll be once it's completed, that's the carbon saving that's delivered for most of them. For example, like the solar farms, it's all delivered at once the solar farm is completed. So for the RAG rating is, as Mary says, we're doing reasonably well with it, but there are some barriers that may prevent it being completed by 2030 that we're working on.
and we try and make that call, so we have that discussion. So for example, with the transport actions, the transport colleagues and the climate emergency colleagues will have that discussion and to think what kind of fits here and what seems the most kind of appropriate RAG to put against that specific action.
So it's qualitative, not quantitative.
It depends on the action. Some of the actions will be based on it, but primarily qualitative, yeah.
Primarily qualitative, not quantitative. Yes.
Correct. Yeah, it's difficult to put a quantitative RAG against, against a lot of them.
Presumably, as you get closer to the date, you might know how far you're missing it by.
Yeah, I think that's it. As new data, as we get new kind of information, we'll have that assessment annually to see if, do we need to change that RAG? And as more data emerges, we can go towards the more quantitative approach of ragging those the different actions.
I think RAG status is always a little bit subjective. What might help would be to have something saying what's the return to green action. What would need to happen in order for this to be green? And then you've got a precise thing you can focus on. And often the thinking process behind working out what that action is can help define better what the RAG status is. So that might be worth thinking about for anything that's not classed as green in the plan.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea and we can take that forward.
That would be helpful for us because you see red, you think, oh my gosh. But if actually you chaps are working at the coalface, seeing it day to day. You know that actually it's not that hard to get it to amber, and it won't be too bad to get it to red, because you know what you're doing. We're reading it cold, and we just see a big red block, and you think, oh.
I think for the purposes of this meeting, we can look at that, and if there are, for example, when we do the deep dives, that's a good opportunity to look at those areas, and we can provide that if needed. It will. I don't know if it would work well for the full document, because that's a lot of detail and it complicates. We're trying to keep the document as easy to read as possible, but we can make it available in another way.
Okay, I think Catherine has some questions.
It was more, I guess, some on the EV charging strategy. I think one of the things I liked from it was that it did lay out quite clearly what the council role was and how it ties into other people. I guess you're hearing you today, Sophia, it feels like to me the one things that perhaps, and I'm not sure if this is a draft or can be adapted after the consultation, but to me the biggest challenge or fear I have with this strategy is that it's very about public charging points, which obviously is where we control. But I think that what you said around assessing what's the need, because I think there's a real risk that we keep going down this route where actually we just don't need many public charging points because the range gets longer and people just charge at home. So the piece that I think it mentions where, you know, we said in no cases would we allow cables crossing a footway, but you mentioned the charging gullies. I do wonder if there's an opportunity within this strategy to at least acknowledge that's something we're looking into, because I think to enable people without off-street parking to access those lower rates in the spirit of just transition is something that we as the council should be maximising. And perhaps that's another element where we can emphasise the kind of community charging in the spirit of how can we get as many people as possible access to the lowest possible charging rates. And those are actions that, you know, one is an awareness, but the other in terms of actually crossing the footway is something that we as a council actually can and I think should, and it sounds like are doing, but wasn't mentioned in that strategy. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Catherine, for your feedback. Exactly, we don't want to have stranded access or charge points that they are not utilized at all. However, we don't want the lack of charging infrastructure to stifling the switch to EV. So it's just to find the right balance. I think it is mentioned within the strategy that we are engaging with other officers and we are monitoring the trials that they have been doing to learn from their experiences. And as I mentioned earlier, according to the latest information that we have received, the government is going to release the guidance around the cross-pavement solutions next month. So following this announcement, we're gonna start either a trial or have a standard procedure of providing this equipment. But we need a mix of solutions, not only gullies, public charge points and in residential areas do play a role. By monitoring usage of the org charge points, there are some of them, they are highly utilized, and these have been embraced by the residents. So yeah, we need to find which charge point is required or what solutions are required to what areas, and it's more likely to be a mix of equipment.
So just specifically, I think it's page 14 of the report just says that in no circumstances will we permit crossing, and I just wonder whether that's an opportunity to at least acknowledge what's being looked into, because I fear that, you know, the public consultation is an opportunity to make residents aware of what we're looking at, and by completely eliminating that, people who don't have off-street parking might think, oh, there's no route for me. But perhaps that's a future iteration of the strategy.
Okay, thank you for that.
Okay, Martin's got a question.
Just one thought. One of the big issues about some of these charging points is, of course, the rate you're paying per unit of electricity. Has there been any thoughts in the industry of allowing a substitution scheme where you, having a smart card or some way of identifying who you are drawing the electricity, you can use electricity at the rate you are using at home. You'd have that use from the charger debited against your normal domestic charging rate. Perhaps there would be some add-on that the provider of the charging point would have for the use of the facility, but instead of paying the 50 pence a unit, you could get closer to the 9 pence a unit that I pay for my off-peak for overnight charging. That just might be a way of, because I know that the providers of the charging points are hit with the full commercial rate, which isn't protected, it's not capped. And if you're able to get that kind of substitution going in the industry, that might be useful, because it's very similar to things that Octopus do with the flow to and from your solar panels.
Yeah. We do ask, as I mentioned earlier, to include smart tariffs or off-peak tariffs, so that at least residents can have access to lower tariffs at times of off-peak or less demand. But I'm not aware of a functionality like this. And also another consideration is that home charging has a 5% VAT, whereas public charge points have 20% VAT. So that also contributes to this a difference in price parities, in price tariffs.
Okay, Shona.
Yeah, earlier on, you mentioned in residential areas that you were looking at having, say, longer charging times to reduce the cost. But what do you mean by longer? Is it 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours? How do you quantify it?
Can you please remind me which slide are you referring to?
I'm not sure it was a slide particularly, but we were talking, I think it was probably one of your questions, actually.
Does this relate to on rapid versus fast?
No, I think we're just talking about residents being able to charge and to make it slightly cheaper by charging over a longer period. Like, what do you mean by a longer period? Is it
probably I refer to the dwell time. So it all depends on how much for how long the vehicle will be parked there or will be stationary. So if they charge overnight and then they can have access to off-peak tariffs, off-peak rates. So it will be the tariffs will be lower compared to if they charge to a rapid charge point and they need a very high quick top up.
Okay, thank you. So I guess what I'm envisaging is if you've got a street or a couple of streets and they have got people with EVs, and someone comes in at 5 o'clock or 7 o'clock, puts it on and stays there overnight, no one else can charge, can they? Most people are going to be charging their cars, I would have thought, overnight if they're working. So how are you going to stop people blocking, or even if they just charge for a couple of hours, it's a night like this and you think, I'm not going out to move my car in the dark and the wet and the rain, and someone else is needing to get to work tomorrow morning and they've no charge. How does that work?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and this is by making sure that there are enough sockets or enough charge points to cover the needs of residents. Also, EV users don't need to charge their car every single day or every single night. Usually, they need once per week, based on the journeys that and the trips that they make. But yeah, I think on average they do need once per week, so residents can accommodate their needs.
Thank you.
Any more questions? No, I think we're happy with that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you as well,
Sophia.
And thanks for your useful feedback. Thank you.
So now we're going to look at the transport part of the SEAP, aren't we? So is somebody going to present something, or we're just going to ask questions?
You haven't got to be there.
Yeah. I thought we're just going to ask you questions. I think that's. Well, it's the same item on the agenda. It's just that we started with the EV strategy, and now we're going to go through the transport part. I don't know whether we want to go through it page by page. Yeah. Okay, it's page 23 is the first page after the EV items.
Could I Jeff, maybe before we dive into the detail, we start with the big picture, which, if I understand it correctly, the largest cause of CO2 emissions from transport is from private cars. We're aiming to reduce the use of emitting private cars by 50% by 2030. Have I got that right? And of that 50% reduction, 2/3 of that is going to come from electric vehicles. We just heard all about the public charging strategy for that. And then I have to flick through to get the other numbers. Is it 10% from modal shift to public transport? So 20% of the total. So yeah, we're aiming to save 50%. So 33% from electric vehicles, 10% from public transport. I can't remember the percent from active travel. Is it also 10%? 10%. Yeah. So that gets us to. Sorry.
Yeah, it's 10%, Adrian, from active travel.
Yeah, perhaps maybe Mario or Rob could take us through the detail rather than me trying to find it. But I think it's worth starting with that big picture.
Yeah.
And then do we have any observations on that before we then drill into the detail?
Yes, so the breakdown on page 12 of the report. So that's where, like you've said, 50% reduction in private car mileage. That's broken down 33% from EV registration, 5% from reduced travel, 2% from public transport increase, and 10% from active travel increase. Then there's a 22% reduction in road freight as well.
Yeah, it's page 12 of the agenda, big number 12 at the bottom.
May I ask a question on that? So to 10% from active transport, and that's a carbon saving of 14,149 tonnes CO2 equivalent. Perhaps you'll send me the answer afterwards. What does that equate to in terms of miles? So if we're looking at active transport, which is walking, cycling, running, whatever, what mileage are we talking about here? Is this? I mean, is that an achievable figure we're looking at, or is it?
And I'm just going to Andrew.
Give me a second. Yeah, I'm trying to find it. Yeah.
Andrew is in the climate emergency team, so he leads on the data and the carbon calculations. So he's best placed to just give a bit of a update on that. But it sounds like he's just kind of getting the relevant documents first.
Has anyone got a question while we're waiting? Caroline.
Just a quick clarification. When you talk about public transport, is that train and buses?
Yes, it's both. The breakdown is further down in the table.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, where I wanted to go with this, which I think is where Peter's going as well, is that getting a third of people driving EVs by 2030 feels credible. Getting 5% of journeys removed feels credible. 2% more public transport feels credible. So 2% of journeys more by public transport feels credible. The 10% of current car journeys, or 10% of the 50%, which I think is 20% of overall car journeys, is 10 times as much as we do at the moment in terms of mileage. And that's the bit that I'd love us to achieve, but I really worry about whether this plan is anywhere near capable of doing that. And that's my interpretation of the numbers, my understanding of the numbers. So is that a correct interpretation? And if so, what do we think about it?
Yep. No, I think that sounds about right, what you're saying. I mean, Andrew might be able to add in a moment. I think a lot of what we're doing already is making an impact. So a lot of the behaviour change work, where we've got what's amber on the list of the active travel measures, is the LC whip. The part that is missing, I think, is the infrastructure. So making people feel safe when they walk and cycle. That's going to be the biggest challenge, I think. There are quite a lot of things we could do that are more straightforward. So trying to look for the quick wins. So if we put in a crossing somewhere where there's a major road that's causing severance, it's going to encourage people to walk rather than feel like they have to get in the car for those short journeys. So trying to increase the number of, or decrease the number of short journeys by car, get more people out walking, cycling. But how we go about doing that, and with the LC whip, there's a lot of measures in there. That estimate of 38 million, now that we're starting to break down some of the measures that are in the LC whip, that's only going up. Obviously, not only with inflation, but just the level of detail that we're going to now, we're finding that it's going to cost a lot of money, and we're not going to get that much money in the next 6 years unless we're pleasantly surprised in October. But we think it's going to be pretty unlikely that that is actually affordable in terms of delivering that whole 50%. So at the moment, it's amber. So I think focusing our efforts on those particular routes, making sure they're successful, is going to be our first stages. But I agree, it isn't very challenging, that target.
Just for reference, for the previous question, it's just over 49,000 miles that the 14,000 tons equates to.
So, I mean, I know Rob and Sophia know my passion for this subject of active travel, but I think it's a tenfold increase in what we're doing at the moment, which in the long term, with the right infrastructure, is definitely achievable. And cities that are invested in active travel, even when there's good public transport alternatives available, are hitting that sort of level. But I just don't see it happening with what we've got in the plan at the moment, in terms of our ability to achieve this. And I think that this is maybe where we need to wait till we do get into the detail, but that's the bit of the overall target that I think lacks a bit of credibility at the moment. And that doesn't mean we should change it or give up on it, but we should have a discussion about, does it lack credibility and how might it be given credibility?
Sorry, I can't hear if anyone's suggesting anything from the room. Maybe following on from that point, Adrian, and one of my questions was going to be exactly on that LCWIP element, is with a climate lens, do we have any data around which perhaps routes, or where's kind of where are we seeing the biggest challenges in terms of, I mean, I live in Charleville, it's just over a mile to Twyford, all of the services are in Twyford, people use the train station in Twyford, but there's very poor infrastructure to get from Charleville to Twyford, so a huge portion of those journeys, which distance wise are very feasible for walking and cycling, very few people do. So my gut feel, and open to being incredibly biased, is that that's somewhere where there's quite a lot of scope for an increase, which could deliver this kind of magnitude of change. Do we have information throughout the borough on where or perhaps which projects within the LCWIP could deliver that kind of more transformational change, rather than perhaps being a small step or less of a transformation?
Yep, that's something we're looking at the moment. So we had the original LCWIP, which is based on the routes that we've got on the network, which is called the primary network. They were all prioritised in partnership with the Walking and Cycling Action Group, Task and Finish Group. But because it's done by the entire route, you're absolutely right. There's some parts of, say, the Reading Road route where there is already a shared path, and although that's not perfect, people can use that. Whereas there's other parts where there's a complete barrier, like trying to cycle up Finchampstead Road, for instance, where you'd rather have something there and not focus on where there's already a shared path. So what we're doing at the moment with some funding from Active Travel England is trying to establish breaking down those entire routes into smaller chunks and then trying to work out what the kind of improvement each of those chunks is going to bring us. So we want to try and focus what money we do get onto the most impactful measures. I think the Charville example is really good because we've got a scheme there that we'd like to do, which obviously runs parallel with the railway line, completely off-road, but it is going to cost on its own something like £5 million because it involves 2 bridges and 1 large ramp as well going up the embankment. So just getting the money for that, which we tried to through the Levelling Up Fund a couple of years ago, would be a big win for that area particularly. And even people from Woodley can come in from there as well. It would open up the whole area to Twyford really, and Twyford's obviously a very popular town and station particularly. So I mean, that is a good one that I'd expect to come out in our future prioritisation.
If the prioritisation as it stands today could be circulated after the meeting, I'd be really interested to see that.
Yeah, there's a link. We can share that online. I believe we're looking to set up the new Cycling Active Travel Task and Finish group in the next few weeks.
Martin.
Just a question for Rob. Are there any really quick hits on roads that have been detrunked where judicious application of white paint could create quite reasonable cycle tracks? And I'm not talking of the 2-foot wide ones you see down the side of the A43 in Northamptonshire, but the sort of thing you see in Belgium with a cycle lane with a neutral zone of probably about half a metre wide between it and the edge of the carriageway. The area I'm thinking of is along the A4. There's a lovely big cross-hatched white area all the way down the centre. If that were to be removed, we've got a path on one side going one way. There's more that would appear to be more than enough space to create another cycle route going the other way on the other side. That might or might not be that appealing to younger families, but those are the kind of things I'm thinking of. Or in Europe, quite often now, you would see a road where there is just one lane in the centre with a dotted line, and the cyclists are either side in their safe territory. And if you're in a car and you meet one coming the other way, you have to wait until you've got a gap in the cyclist to pull over. So you could both end up, in quiet roads. That's seems to be another way that's used over there to create cycle routes at an affordable price.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a great idea. We've got a few issues. The problem is we're very much bound to LTM 120, so making sure we meet what is in those standards, especially if we're funded by Active Travel England, especially we can't deviate from that at all. Yeah. We do have some ability to deviate from those standards, but it's still difficult, I suppose, to implement something that isn't in the LTM 120 standards now, which unfortunately has put up the cost of everything quite a lot because of those standards that we're trying to meet. I think the Belgian example is a good one where we could potentially be sometime in the future, but that's a massive kind of culture shift, I think, in terms of the way drivers behave as much as it is kind of the infrastructure we put since kind of the 60s really, and the advent of motorways and major trunk roads. Cars always been king really, and although even now the new highway code says we must give way to pedestrians and then cyclists, it very rarely happens. And even as a driver myself, I find myself sometimes forgetting to give way to those cyclists and pedestrians because it's just a habit that's been formed over so many years. It's really difficult.
Any more questions?
I guess before we get into the detail, then just to answer that question, how credible do we think that this target is with the actions and the anticipated flow of funding from government at the moment? Because the top level action 1A4 says we're going to save 10%. We're going to have 10% of the 10% of current car journeys from active travel by 2030, saving 14,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. And we're saying it's green at the moment overall. I think is that, or in fact, no, that's, sorry, there isn't an overall metric, is there? But it's green and it's a mix of green and amber, I think, at the moment. Yeah, it's a mix of, it's all green apart from one that's amber at the moment. Do we feel that's do the team feel that's an accurate assessment?
Yeah, so just to say, I think with our climate emergency action plan, we recognise it is very ambitious with our carbon neutral target of 2030. So there are some actions within this, within the transport section, within the wider plan, that are ambitious. So, but we wanted, I think, when it was set to stretch ourselves and to push ourselves. I think from the RAG status against these actions, we don't have an overall one. But yeah, so the RAG status against those specific actions, we feel as the team, they are on track. Did you want to add anything?
No, I think we've kind of covered it really. It is the whole issue, I think, for me, is the infrastructure part of it. The My Journey team doing a great job with all of the mode shift stuff they do. All the schools are now, almost every child in the borough is now trained to bikeability in year 6 before they go up to secondary school. So they are starting to get those skills where they could cycle to secondary school. And they are trained in such a way that they could actually cycle on the roads, even though you might not necessarily want them to, especially as a father. It's sometimes quite worrying, send them off on some roads. But yeah, so we're doing a lot of the things really right, which is great, I think, and we're doing a good job in lots of areas. It's just the infrastructure, I think, is the one where we, unless we start getting a lot more money, which I mean the amount we're looking at isn't going to come, we don't think, but we are graded as a level 2 in the DFT's assessments of active travel England cycle kind of readiness, which puts us in a really good position. There's a few that are level 3, but apart from Reading, all of our neighbours are level 1, so we're above to all our neighbours, which means when the funding does come, we're potentially going to get more than those people. Still probably not enough, is what I'd say.
So if I just say one more thing and then I'll move on. I mean, with the possible levels of funding, and the government's talked about unprecedented levels of funding for this, which would mean 2 million a year or more. We're saying we need 38 million, which I think is probably a lowball estimate. So that's 19 years to do this. And then probably there's a 5 to 10 year lag between providing the infrastructure and seeing the level of increase that we'd need. So on this fairly optimistic, challenging plan, we're looking at 20 plus years to achieve this, I would suggest. And therefore, I think this part of the plan it's certainly ambitious, but I don't think it's realistic with the current levels of funding. And so, again, what do we need to do to make it realistic?
I think it's probably going back to what was mentioned earlier about that prioritisation and picking those most impactful schemes. Because if we can spend 80,000 on a new crossing that gets everybody kind of who effectively landlocked from one estate to get into another and be able to travel more easily, that's going to be a much more effective use than just laying one route that only goes from A to B and doesn't necessarily help an awful lot of people. So the work we're doing now will hopefully kind of help us refine that. And so that 50% that we're aiming to deliver of the LC whip could become something like 10%, but it'll be the 10% that's the most impactful that will give us the results that we want, I think.
Martin.
I think it's a good plan. I like the idea of where we're going. That direction of travel is right. And I think perhaps we just need to, I think the prioritisation will get the big wins early. And it will take a while. I mean, I think we'd have to remember it took the Dutch 40 years to get to where they got. And so if we do it in 20, we can pat ourselves on the back. So it will take a while to get to it. We get some big wins early that will actually inspire everybody to continue with the project, and it will have a big payoff in the end.
Okay, so shall we proceed through the document?
Catherine Sophia's very patiently got her hand up.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. I just wanted to add on that one that a good opportunity is also to make sure that the active travel network is in place in new developments where we have a white canvas. So it's a good opportunity to make sure that the infrastructure is there and residents will start shaping their new travel habits.
Have you got more to say? Yes, I know you.
That was for me just to highlight, that new developments is another option we can focus apart from looking at quick wins.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, Rob.
Just to add to that, Sophia's absolutely right. I should have mentioned they're also a source of funding potentially as well. So having that LC whip in place does mean that when a development comes forward, we know where we want to put in any potential infrastructure funding they give us. So it's not just grants that we're looking for, but other sources as well.
Yeah.
I will say something. Nothing I said is meant to be any criticism of what the team has been doing, because I know how hard you work on this and know how passionate you are. But I just feel there's a disconnect between the target and the resources we're allocating to it at the moment.
So has anyone got anything to say about other aspects of the SEAT, the transport, other than active travel? Caroline?
I was just going to make a suggestion. You're talking on page 23 about commuter trips and trying to encourage people to share travel. Is there any way you could encourage them if they use one of our parking spaces that we could give them reduced parking costs? So if they take 2 named passengers, they get £1 off of their parking to encourage them. Because it's more about not just the carbon saving, but to the person who's doing the driving. Thank you.
Didn't know if someone else was going to take that, but I'll take that away. It's definitely a good idea. We do have, obviously set parking charges that are written through TROs and things like that, so potentially technically quite difficult, but it's definitely something worth considering.
Thanks.
I see that just looking at kind of the actions which are amber and red, and sorry, Catherine, if you because I can't hear much. I see the bus service improvement plan is currently rated as amber. So is this an opportunity to understand a little bit on why that is, and to what we were saying before, what's needed to kind of bring that up to green?
So, Rebecca?
Yeah, I'm quite happy to go through bus services and the bus service improvement plan. I think in the copy I was looking at it was green, so yeah, we'll have to have a look at that. But if I just give you a bit of background and what some of the challenges are in the industry and with bus services and the bus service improvement plan and where I think the opportunities are, then maybe we can talk about some questions after, draw out what we need to from that. So from a climate perspective, the bus has a role in trying to reduce those single occupancy car trips, has the ability to take 75 cars off the road if you're looking at certain makes and models of vehicles. So what we try and do is make the bus as easy to use for residents as possible, attractive, affordable, and provide that greener alternative as a travel choice. Now, that sounds like a fairly straightforward objective and something that's quite simple, but unfortunately underneath all that, there are some significant challenges that we as a council and the bus industry face in trying to deliver that. So just to give you a flavour of what some of those challenges are, as with everything, COVID had an absolutely devastating impact on the industry. We lost passengers overnight. We fell to 30% of pre-COVID levels in 2020, and we've had to build back from that point. Buses are quite unique in that they are an ongoing revenue cost. So if we as a council put funding into buses, that tends to be an ongoing funding revenue stream we have to find. We obviously aim to reduce it over time, but our role as a council is to provide what is socially necessary, not what is commercially viable. So it does become an ongoing funding stream. Over the past few years, the industry's faced massive inflationary costs. We all know that inflation's been running into double digits. That's the same has been true as the industry. But because the industry was receiving grants from central government, the terms and conditions that came with those grants meant they couldn't increase fares to reflect the true cost of operating those services. So when we did get back on track, we were held down by the fares because there was a massive gap between fares and costs. The industry, like many others, have faced limited resources. They've had limited drivers, and now we're in mechanic shortages. So there's an ongoing resourcing issue there, which limits what we can do in terms of improving services. From the council's point of view, those increasing costs have been reflected in our tender costs where we are contracting services. Last year, the executive agreed to put in over 700,000 per year of additional funding just to support what we had. That's not with improvements or any enhancements. And then underpinning it all, you've got regulation and legislation, 1985 Act, which put bus companies into private ownership. So unless you already had a bus company as a local transport authority, you weren't allowed to set up a new one. From the greener perspective, I guess, within Woking Borough, we don't have a bus depot. So if you were looking at electric buses, that's quite an issue because you've got to run them out of Reading or Bracknell. Reading, when you're running an electric bus, it's down to daily work that vehicle's doing and the number of miles that you can get out of it. So if you're going for your longer inter-urban routes, then you possibly have to put another bus into the routes operation. That increases the cost and reduces the viability. We have got some routes which are ideal for electric, but then they run out of Bracknell. Bracknell's on a short-term lease, and the operator's unwilling to invest, plus their contracted services. So there's issues around that as well. But so there are some challenges, and they're quite significant in terms of what we need to overcome, but there are also opportunities. So the BSIP and the Enhanced Partnership Agreement is one of those opportunities. It was written as our vision for what we could do with bus services if we had the funding to do that. And it was initially a bidding document to the Department for Transport. Unfortunately, we didn't receive what we would have liked to receive. We received about 800,000 over a 2-year period. Some other authorities received millions of pounds, and our bid certainly was for 34 million. So it was nowhere close to what we asked for. But it still provides a good starting point for setting out our vision. And within that document, there's also an implementation plan. So there's things in there which are funded and what we have been doing. And then there's a set of proposals of what we would like to do, but they're unfunded. And then there's some targets and measures and progress. And the idea is you produce an annual progress report each year, but we haven't quite got to that point because instead the DfT are asking us to revise the BSIP every year at the moment. So whilst we did fall to about 30% of passenger levels, we are recovering well. we're roughly across network about 90%. Different routes have different recovery rates. But if we were taking an average, that's roughly where we're sitting at the moment. And this September, we've seen some really positive signs. We've got the 21 Clarets over in Lower Early back up to their 15-minute pre-COVID frequency. We've got the Leopard. Some of it has dropped, but other parts of it have increased to a 15-minute frequency. We're using grant funding to pump prime the Park and Ride at Winnersh. That's back onto a 15-minute frequency 6 days a week. And we've got, whilst Arriva are no longer operating within the borough, Carousel have come in and they've put in a 20-minute frequency on the 850 and a Sunday service. So there are some positive signs. So we do hope that will start to push some growth through as well.
Great, thank you. Adrian.
Thank you. That sounded quite positive, which is great news. Do we know, we talk in the plan about a 2% increase in the amount of, or sorry, 2% of the reduction in car journeys being moved to public transport. Do we know what that equates to in terms of the current use of public transport? So is it a 50% increase or 10% increase or so on?
Oh, I'm not 100% sure. I know what the targets are in the BSIP, and I think that may have come from an original target in the BSIP quite some time ago. So at the minute, we're sitting at about 2.2 million passenger journeys, which is DFT figures. They get published once a year. So I think that is possibly the 50% increase in public transport use, which was what is currently sitting as our 2029, 2030 target. And that's 3.3 million off of our 2.2 million baseline, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think that does make sense. I'm trying to relate what 2% of car journeys or 4% of total car journeys equates to in terms of number of bus trips, so that we can link the target to what we're actually achieving in terms of primarily bus, but bus and rail travel. I don't know whether that information, that link has been made. Do we know what it means?
We can have a look at putting that in somewhere, again, whether it's on the main report or somewhere in supporting information about the link from mileage to the carbon saving, because obviously that will be helpful for the active transport one as well. So we'll try and make that clear somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's fundamental. I mean, this is all about modal shift, isn't it? And we know how much of the car mode we want to shift. But we need to equate it to what we're shifting it to for it to make sense in terms of a target. Because I say we just don't. I know the active travel figures because I've done the research myself, but I've no idea what it means in terms of an increase in bus service. It sounds, if we've got a target to increase bus use by 50%, it sounds like we may be well on track, but I just don't know without making the link.
I think Katrine wants to ask a question, say something.
Yeah. So it sounds about 50%, and the new 850 service is fantastic. I've been using it quite a lot. But so I guess when we're talking about climate and carbon savings, one of the things, of course, being the technology that the buses are actually running. So and again, reflecting on, we've currently got some pretty, I'd say, relatively older double deckers running with currently probably not enough people. So from a climate perspective, that's probably no better than having car journeys, particularly if they're kind of newer and or electric cars. So in terms of the industry, so as well as electric, I'm aware that there's quite a lot of renewable transport obligation incentives to use bio-CNG in buses. And I think Reading buses are I remember them talking at a conference I went to about 8 years ago, being in that. Is that still so where's the bus industry as a whole, I guess, and when do we kind of expect this turnover in bus fleet into these newer, less emitting technologies, or is that still very dependent on sort of subsidy funding to incentivize essentially retirement of older, more polluting stock into less emitting buses?
Okay, there's a couple of ways that the bus industry are looking to make buses greener, if you like. There's conversion from older vehicles, so you can convert the catalytic converters and make them greener, reducing the carbon nitrates, I think it is, from the exhaust. So some of the buses have had that conversion done, and there was some grant funding from DFT to allow that. I think the report that came out earlier this week said there's mixed reviews on how effective that is, and mainly maintenance is the key thing for those vehicles. There is a lot of purchasing of newer vehicles, which is Euro 6 emissions. I think we are about 70% of the fleet operating within the borough is actually classified as a Euro 6. And then there's the gas buses, which Reading buses have had for a number of years and still tend to use. Their depot is very well equipped for gas buses. But we are moving towards the electric buses. You have to have the right infrastructure within the depots, and there are some difficulties with running them, as I said, about the longer routes, but some routes are suitable. And there's government funding to help support that. So there's the Zebra bid, which was the zero emission bus regional area bids. So Reading buses were successful in the second round of that, and we are due to get 7 vehicles across for the Claret route next year, I believe it is. So that will be the first electric buses within Woking Borough. And hopefully the industry will continue to move in that direction. There will be they will stop selling the diesel buses at some point in time. I'm not sure that date has been set yet. There was a consultation out with the industry on that. But I think we're expecting it to be about 2035 or slightly before. So at the moment, we're not sure what new funding will come forward for converting or helping the industry move to those electric buses. And when that funding does come forward, the operators are still having to fund the base cost of the bus, plus a 25% uplift towards the electric element. And then the other 75% difference is funded by the grant funding. And it all depends on the operators cascading of vehicles through the fleet. So Reading Buses has quite a new fleet, but not all operators are in that position. So someone like Carousel or Arriva or Stagecoach, it will take them a bit longer usually to cascade their fleet through. So that's where we are at the moment.
And sorry, just slight supplementary on the and this is more industry in general, are you seeing significantly lower running costs by switching to electric? You know, as a kind of personal EV driver, that's one of the main benefits. And is that something we can expect to help perhaps move us away from the subsidy model that we're currently stuck in for bus routes?
Quite possibly, as we don't run any electric vehicles within the borough. I don't actually have a running cost of an electric bus versus diesel, but I would expect to see that. Yeah. It's whether the maintenance costs are also going down.
Thanks.
Martin.
As a quick one, in the aviation industry, we use seat. It's based on seat kilometres and aircraft kilometres for the sort of measurement of what's happening. So perhaps if we had an indication of cycling kilometres per person, and then bus ridership, how many passenger kilometres are done, we get some idea. Same with cars, passenger car occupancy, kilometres per passenger, so to speak. It sort of brings it all back to one. You probably would have to then put in some distance things, because most people walk up to a mile quite happily, and they'll cycle up to about 3 or 4 miles quite happily on a normal bike, maybe about 6 or 8 on an e-bike. But you get an idea of how it's having an impact. I mean, cycling is going to have no impact on somebody commuting 30 miles, but have a huge impact on somebody commuting 3, 4 or 5 miles. and this is short distances which get used most. That's a bit people miss. Most car journeys are very, very short. Substantial percentage are very, very short and quite easily doable on an e-bike for sure, given you've got the right clothing for the winter, of course.
Moses.
Just wanted a bit more explanation of this red RAG rating on page 28 and the impact on the overall plan.
Okay, the RAG rating on page 28 is to do with demand responsive transport. Yes, it's red. So demand responsive transport, for anybody that doesn't know what that is, you're looking at something like the Uberization of bus services. So you're calling them on demand, and it tends to be app-based and telephone bookings in advance. The reason that that one is red is because initially Department of Transport came out with a bid or a grant fund, and they asked for local authorities to bid for the grant funding to implement DRT, as we call it. The requirements of that bid is that you came up with a commercially viable model but looked at rural areas, which by its very nature doesn't really work, because rural areas you don't have the passengers and therefore the revenue need to make something commercially viable. So we chose an area which covered Woodley, Wargrave, Twyford, Charville, and created a zone around that, hoping that the demand from Woodley would offset the not so, where the more rural area where you're not going to get quite as much demand, and Twyford Station and Village being at the centre of the zone, being quite attractive, along with Woodley Town Centre. The response we got back from the DFT on that was that it was too urban area covered, and they didn't provide us with any funding. So beyond that, we did work with there's two main players in this market. One's Padam, the other's Veer. We did work with Padam to do some modelling. We used our traffic model that our development management team and planning team have, and we fed those trips into a demand responsive model, and we used the bus data as well from various operators. And we looked at our current supported network, which is mainly in the Wokingham town area and South Wokingham area. We worked with Bracknell to do the bit of Wokingham without and Crowthorne area as well to feed that in. We created a zone and we looked at what the options and viability would be of that. And the conclusion we came to is we'd be no better off, no worse off in terms of financial viability on the service. We did take out the 121 route, which serves the Norries area, and also the 128 route, which is quite a long route that comes all the way from Reading and through various villages on its way through to Wokingham. The reason being that with demand responsive, once you hit a certain level of passengers, you're better off on a fixed route anyway. So demand responsive is good if you've got dispersed pattern of trips, whereas if you've got strong A to B flows, you're moving lots of people between two destinations, you might as well have a regular service that people can rely on. The reason we ended up at that conclusion is when we looked at it, basically the trip times, when we modelled it, we came to the point that we were no better off, no worse off financially, but then we looked at what were the benefits and the disbenefits. So obviously the benefit was that those within rural areas have a more accessible service. However, the disbenefits were that you had to book the service, and you couldn't guarantee what time someone was going to end up at their destination, because you're given a window. So you may say, I want to go and catch a train, I want to get to school, and the app or the person on the phone could only give you a window of time. So we couldn't guarantee you were going to get there, which then meant you got a reduced number of people using it. And at peak times, we couldn't always guarantee that you were going to get a trip or the offer of a ride because it's busy, and if it's fully booked, the only way of doing that is adding more vehicles into the system. And the way you procure that type of service is you procure a certain number of vehicles per zone. So there were some quite significant disbenefits, but for those that haven't got a regular service, that maybe got one every 2 hours or one once a week, it would be a significant benefit, because if you ring up, you could get something within 30 minutes and it's corner to corner. So you're not going to have to travel far to get there. And for those with disabilities, actually you can pre-book that you're going to be taking a wheelchair or that you've got certain needs. And then the driver knows that before getting there, and they can get the right vehicle to you. So it was much for muchness, but we continued with the current pattern of service and re-procured our town services as they were. And that's why it's red, because we didn't go ahead with it. And even though it's in the BSIP to look at for different areas, it's not something that we are actively pursuing at this time.
I'm just thinking whether there shouldn't be a different classification if it's not going to go. I'm not going ahead with it. Why is it retained? If it's not an option we are pursuing.
Well, I think it's a good idea that it stays in there, because I think it should be looked at again, probably. I have actually been asked for this from Farley Hill recently. So, I mean, that's an area that could be looked at. I don't know whether you looked at it before.
We do look at things like that, and we will remove actions if we know they're completely never going to happen. But at the moment, it stays red in terms of, as you say, it could happen at some point in the future. If we know it won't, then we'll remove it.
Shall we move on? Are there any questions about school? Oh, we've talked about cycling, haven't we? Rob mentioned that. More on the LC whip?
Not on the LC whip per se itself. The same general point I've made a couple of times already about relating the percentage modal shift we're trying to achieve to what level of that mode is currently used, so that we have some feel for what level of increase we're looking for. And I say I don't know what it is for buses, but it's enormous for walking and cycling. Certainly for the cycling end, maybe less so for walking, but it's still many times what we're currently achieving, rather than an incremental increase. So we need to understand that. And there are two possible ways of understanding what we're doing currently. There's the National Travel Survey data, which is quite high level, and I'm never sure how reliable it is, but it does exist by local authority. So we have some idea of what distances we're travelling by different modes in Wokingham Borough at the moment. The other is obviously to measure what we're doing. It sounds as if we have quite good data on bus travel at the moment. I presume because people buy tickets and someone records the fact they've made the journey, which is good. We seem to have a reasonable understanding of car travel at the moment, but I don't know how well we know how many miles are being walked or cycled at the moment. I think we were introducing some modal cameras a few years ago. I don't know what happened to those. Could we say something a bit about how we're trying to understand what active travel we're doing at the moment and how that might be changing?
Yep. Yeah, sure. So the cameras you're talking about are called Vivacity cameras. So they're basically, they do a visual process analysis, so they don't record any video, because obviously that's quite often a controversial subject. But they basically identify what it is that they're seeing moving along the road, whether it's and path as well. So you can go down to pedestrian, cyclist, scooter even, as well as motorbikes and cars and lorries. And we have, I'm going to get the number wrong, probably around about 12, I think now, around the borough. A lot of them were purchased during COVID, using some of that emergency funding that was provided by government, partly because we wanted to see what was happening in the town centres. Vivacity also had a function which could tell you whether people were social distancing or not. So they were trying to identify how far apart people were staying and that kind of thing, which was always kind of interesting, but not particularly that useful. So we do have those sensors. They were originally put out, as I say, around the town centres mostly to monitor what was happening. Just in Wokingham town, I should say, we didn't go to any other town centres with the cameras, but we also use them on some of our schemes. So the Barkham Road bridge, which we converted from a single carriageway to the 2 lanes, had a camera on it for a while, and so that camera's still there and it's still recording information, but it's served its purpose in terms of telling us our before and after flows and that kind of thing. And we've got a couple of others around the area that are doing similar things, sort of looking at previous schemes and just still collecting data, but they will give us that background cycle level and kind of walking level for those particular locations. The difficulty is, of course, we're now looking at where we could put them next and where else they could go. So we could look at other town centres, look at Woodley, Twyford, Early. But it's very difficult to get a kind of background level, I think. So those surveys are really good in terms of National Travel Survey. People actually respond and tell you how often they cycle and walk a week and how far, I think, as well. So you get an idea for the distance. Obviously, the vivacity sensors just give you a snapshot of one kind of count line, if you like, of where people are walking. And quite often you could find yourself putting them on a scheme like the Reading Road scheme. If that was to go ahead, we'd start counting a big increase in cyclists and probably give ourselves a pat on the back. But what we don't know is all the people that were cycling a different route have just changed their route. So they're the same cyclists, just changed direction. So there's a lot of different kind of difficulties with that. And it is something we're kind of wrestling with, really, is kind of having some, I suppose, neutral vivacity sensors, as well as some that are around the place looking at schemes and kind of different areas. But yeah, it is a challenge, is the answer.
And does the data we have tell us anything about what's happening with active travel at the moment?
So what we have seen is it's staying roughly the same. There's not been a huge increase. I mean, as you'd expect, the weather's a big factor. So during some periods it looks really good. You look at other times, it looks really bad. So where we did the NCN 422 scheme, which is on page 35, 33, that scheme was delivered using LEP funding. It was all pre-LTM 120 standards, so it's effectively now a mixture of shared path and mandatory lane on the road. So we have been looking at how that's been changing since it was implemented, and it hasn't changed a huge amount. But the problem is we've been doing that with annual surveys, so just a 1 week snapshot. And you're so dependent on the weather when you do a 1 week survey like that. You try and pick a neutral month as well, so you don't try and do it in summer, you try and do it in kind of spring or autumn. So it's always a difficult way to do it. So I think vivacity is probably the future. And we are hoping with some of our capability fund from Active Travel England to potentially get some more vivacity sensors, which will give us a bit more information. But yeah, we can't know everything all the time, unfortunately.
Just to add from a kind of CEAP perspective, it's something that we want to, we recognise that data is so key in understanding what is the movement across the borough, that the carbon savings, although they tell us something, they are really big, and to kind of understand at a smaller level, it's difficult. So we want to create a kind of a broad CEAP dashboard with some data points and understanding what are the key, what data is there that we can extract to kind of share within this dashboard. So it might be, like Rob said, that National Travel Survey data, but I know last ONS we talked about EPC data, and just we're in the process of kind of identifying what those data points are and then collating them. So there is that kind of overview across the CEAP to help share that kind of pathway that we're on at a more detailed level.
Caroline and then Catherine.
Thank you. Just because I'm over 55, you say you've got 3% reduction in car use. How many is that in people? Just wondering. It's on page 32. You've got 55 over 55s. I wonder why over 55s, but that's not a question. It's leading to a 3% reduction in car use. I just wondered how much 3%, because I presume you're trying to get the older generation out of their car, slightly older. So,
hoping
Is this-
that
is
because
this-
that's what he is.
Is this one of the active transport actions, the bikeability one, or the bike training one? Just trying to clarify which is it that action?
1A47 on page 32.
So that was one of our Shine projects. So it was aimed specifically at the over 55s. Unfortunately, Shine has been cancelled by the Sports and Leisure Department. We looked at potentially restarting it within just the My Journey team and running it by ourselves. But there are so many different over 55s cycling groups available that rather than restarting it, we're just signposting our current members into those additional groups rather than spending the money on just a very small group of people. We're signposting people into the groups that are already active.
thank you. And roughly how many of the, when you talk about 3%?
So that would have come from one of Andrew's figures.
Yeah.
Sorry, Andrew.
So okay, I'm just sorry. It's difficult to do some of these on the fly in terms of looking at.
Don't worry, just email me.
That's okay. Yeah, I can do it via email. It was there's things like 40,000 residents over 60. So yeah, I'll email it.
Hey, Katrine.
Zooming out a little bit into the I guess transport as a whole and the role of the council, I guess across all the themes, one of the things that I'm quite keen to understand is how are we role modelling where we want the rest of the borough to get to? So perhaps, Amari, it might be that, I don't know if there's a separate section of the CAP that speaks to council and therefore transport within council is in there, but do we have a sense of where, for instance, changing out switching the council fleet of vehicles over to EVs and how that's going, or is there more that we need to be doing there? That's one example. I'm thinking, council scope one really in the transport section.
Yes, so you are right. We have a separate section with council specific actions, which we have our council fleet sitting in that section. So where we're at is we did have we had a report produced by the Energy Saving Trust. I think it was last year prior to me being in post, but that kind of provided kind of guidance and recommendations for the council on changing our fleet. So where we're at with that, we have had a number of teams that have needed to purchase new vehicles, and they have purchased electric. As the climate team, we have had officers from other teams contact us to get advice and guidance, which I think is really positive. One of the challenges we have with our fleet is that we don't have a centralized fleet management. So there's no, and each team will kind of purchase new vehicles when they need to. And obviously we don't want to push for electric. We want to, when they don't need it, it's getting the most out of the current vehicle, and then when they look to buy electric. So what we've done, so it's difficult because we don't have that centralized process, but where we've produced guidance internally, we've put out communication internally, we've tried to kind of understand what we can do and how we can influence and kind of put that out there. So that's where we're at with the fleet. We've also, from a staff travel perspective, I know My Journey does a lot from the cycling walking side of things, but we have had the a new staff benefits scheme launch recently, and that includes benefits for staff to get electric vehicles, which again I think is a good news story, and it's good to see that that's recognised, that's the kind of move we want to be taking as a council. So they're the kind of some good news stories that I think we can talk about and celebrate. But also the challenge, there are some challenges.
Yeah, so thanks. I mean, that sounds like, and I'll go back and look at that section as well, but it sounds like where the council has control of, within budget, like you said, of not replacing vehicles sooner than they needed to be anyway, which is budgetary and carbon considerations. It sounds like we're on the right path of walking the talk in terms of the switches that we're hoping for the rest of the budget.
We've recognised the opportunities that we have, and we have kind of done action where we think we can influence, and always we will continue to kind of look to see, actually, is there other ways that we can do more as well.
Thank you.
I was going to ask about the next red one, which is obviously quite challenging, the developing a domestic and industrial freight management policy. Page 34, reduced road freight.
So that's me again. That's basically red because we haven't started it, is the simple answer. So the local transport plan, which I think is the next one down, isn't it? Or further down, 2 down. The local transport plans obviously are key to everything that we do. So we're just getting that finalised at the moment, having consulted earlier this year. It should be going to full council in March if it goes through the rest of the process smoothly. Once that's all finished off, the freight management strategy would be one of the next ones that we do. It's just in terms of the whole of the transport plan itself, it's not necessarily a priority, but it is something that we need to do. I think it's more a timing thing, because we said that 25, 26, I think it'd be unlikely to have anything written and adopted by that time.
Okay, thank you. Caroline.
I just want to ask a question on that. I know the answer, but it's no, that's slightly odd, didn't it? I know why it's red, but I didn't understand this bit about empty vans and empty journeys. It was just understanding that a bit better. It says it's on the explanation in reducing the number of empty runs, because I've worked in retail with vans to come up with the stuff, empty it. I don't know how I'm going to fill it up, but it's a logistic thing. I just wanted to understand it a bit better. Thank you.
No, exactly. I think it is just that, really. It's trying to, can you make use of those empty spaces that you have? Can we have things like freight consolidation? Obviously works in places like London, but in a kind of smaller environment, is that kind of thing going to work, and will it give us more, or make sure that all the vans that are coming into Wokingham are at capacity when they come in, rather than having a large lorry with a couple of vans and things at the back of it?
I think that'd be very difficult. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. But one of the things that we have got, I think it must be further up, is the cargo bike work that we've been doing. There's a company called Pedal and Post who have moved into a depot near Reading buses, I think. So they're operating from Reading at the moment. I believe they've started anyway. Ali might tell me more, but so they were planning on starting there. They're potentially going to be delivering out into Wokingham, that area, Shinfield area. Go on, Ali. Are they there?
So they are very, very successful in Oxford. They have been looking at expanding recently. So they will take an area that is currently low use. So in Reading, they are looking at the cattle market, the old cattle market there. For us, they were looking at some of our park and rides, particularly Copped Beach. They bring in a couple of shipping containers. They put all of their cargo bikes from there, and then all of the small vans, so the Every deliveries, the Amazon deliveries, the DPD, they would drop all of their deliveries to this one central location, and then the cargo bikes go out and deliver from there. So they're reducing the amount of vans within our town centres. The delivery doesn't change for the home user. They won't know that it has been moved to a cargo bike. There is no difference in timing. But for us, it's a lot less vans on the road and a lot of idling. So when they park, they generally idle, jump out, pop post in. So a lot of that gets taken off the road. And in Oxford, I think they're currently saving something like 26 vans per quarter of Oxford town centre per day. So obviously Reading and Wokingham, Bracknell aren't quite as busy as Oxford, but we are hoping to have a big reduction in van usage.
I was just going to say that's very interesting. Peter.
Sounds very interesting. I can't personally see that working. I'm pleased to be proved wrong, but you know, an Amazon driver has loaded their van up with stuff to deliver. They've got a short time span to do that delivery, and you expect them to drive up to Park and Ride, unload all that stuff into a cargo bike in a different order than it went in the van, and then go out and deliver it. So good luck, but I don't think that's going to work.
The driver would unload and then he leaves. He's now done. There is then a team of cyclists and a team of bikes who then go out and do the deliveries. I can send you all of the details for parcel and post and all of the information we've got separately to this if that's something of interest to everyone.
And who's paying for those final mile delivery? Well, they already paid for the guy in the van, or the person in the van, to drop the stuff off, and then I'll be interested to see the business model, but I guess that's not my problem. It's the problem of the cargo bike company. So if it works, fantastic. But the question I was going to ask is about another delivery drivers. So the motorbikes that charge around with pizzas in the back. There are electric mopeds, and there are schemes where these electric mopeds use exchangeable batteries. So you swap the battery rather than charging. You swap your battery out. So those sorts of schemes would take those mopeds, those polluting mopeds, off the road and then exchange them for electric mopeds. Is that a scheme that anybody has looked into? Because I know there are schemes running in other towns and cities. Can we look at that and see if we can get some of those polluting vehicles off the road and swapping them out for electric bikes?
That's one we can look at, but it's not one we have looked at to date. But it's something that we can add to the list.
Perhaps we can bring it to a future meeting.
Well, can you send us details of pedal and post? That'd be interesting.
I will do.
Thanks. I think we've sort of got to the end. If nobody wants to go back to something, Shona.
Really, just out of interest. So the roll out the Healthy School Streets programme, which sounds great to me, on page 30, page 31A43, where you're looking at reducing the length of time that the school the pickup times, or for cars. Is that for the parents? Is that the turnaround time for the parents, or is this to stop other cars parking there? I just didn't quite understand what it meant.
So school streets are a scheme where the road around, or a section of road around the school, is closed for a period. So either from the start, around drop-off time and picking up time. So it's to
closed for whom? Other traffic or to the parents?
Everybody. So residents would still have access, so they'd get their own permit, but nobody else can drive through those sections. Or they can, if they're already parked in there, they could leave, but they couldn't enter.
Okay, so does that push the problem further away?
That's one of the potential issues, which is why we have to do a feasibility study on each site that we do, just to see what is actually viable, what the impact's going to be. For instance, we did look at Radstock, but there are a lot of neighbouring cul-de-sacs that kind of feed in through little alleyways. So that knock-on effect, if we only had one closure, would have potentially moved onto another cul-de-sacs area. So they need to get another camera, and then you find yourself chasing your tail kind of thing. What we need to do is make sure there's alternative kind of walking and cycling like routes, and appropriate routes that people can take.
But if you pushed it out far enough, you'd make sure that the streets were safe enough to walk along. I know we were
just close the hole.
Well, I remember when we lived in Germany once. I don't know if they still do it in Germany, but children were not allowed. All children, you weren't allowed to take your child by car. If you could only drive as far as a mile to the school. Within a mile, you had to walk.
Yeah,
and that made the streets.
Yeah, that's great.
More.
Yeah, I mean, we try and encourage that kind of behaviour. So we have an active travel officer who works with schools who helps them develop their own travel plans, and they have what's called mode shift stars. process where you get graded. I think it's now it used to be gold, silver, and bronze, which is like straightforward. But now I think it's excellent, outstanding, and good. The order.
Interesting.
But yeah, so we do try and encourage that kind of behaviour, but it's just not having a real stick to say, right, if you live a mile away, if you live less than a mile away, you must drive. Isn't really something we can enforce, I suppose. So yeah, trying to do it with a camera on a road closure for a short period of time is what we're looking at. But it would still need that camera. Still cost a lot of money to run and maintain. So it almost needs people to come in and break the rules to help keep the camera paid for. So
I don't think you'll have much trouble with that.
So yeah, it is a difficult one, and we've spoken to West Berks, have a couple that are running successfully at the moment. Reading have one or two that they've been running not with a camera but with volunteers. The problem that we've got with that is the volunteers are generally parents, and so parents telling other parents not to drive through a barrier kind of leads to conflict and a little bit of get a little bit nasty. So we didn't feel that it would really be appropriate to try and rely on kind of volunteers, especially when they're put in that position. And I think the Reading one, they had to move. They stopped doing mornings, I think, so they're only doing the afternoon just because they couldn't get enough volunteers together to kind of run the whole thing morning and night, or morning and afternoon.
Good luck. Yeah, I mean, it'd be great if we did have a culture change, wouldn't it? And it was safe for children to walk to school. And the fact is, I mean, you hear so many parents that are frightened to let their children go to school, and it's not usually because of traffic, it's because they think they're going to be abducted, murdered, or, I don't know what. But, if you're walking in numbers, you'll be walking in safety, aren't you, that generally, with kids.
As a cyclist, I don't go up until about 9:15 in the morning when the suicide run to and from school is finished, and I try and get back before 2:45 before it starts again. So it's the most unpleasant time to be on the road.
I know. Thank you.
Okay, have we finished? Great. Have we got any specific actions that we want to? I mean, I think the officers have been making notes and taking actions.
Can I suggest that I write up the discussion and the key points, and that they then get submitted to the climate emergency team, and through that to the as part of the papers that go to council, and then we can monitor what's happened further down the road. No pun intended.
Thanks. Yeah, the key thing for me is this linking modal shift to what it means the percentage change in the mode we're shifting to. I think without that, it's very difficult to understand what we're trying to achieve and what we need to do to achieve it.
Okay, yes. Make that a specific action then. Caroline.
Just to say, right at the very beginning, you made some point about the RAG rating that you would like in later in the reports.
Yeah, so that was to indicate what the action is to return to green if an action is amber or red. That's always a good practice.
Thank you very much. Bye. Go home now. Oh, we've got that lot. Oh, yes. Sorry. Yes. Right. Has anyone got anything to say about the work programme? Obviously, yes.
Just in terms of the timing, so the 5th of November meeting, we're going to look at new development, in particular to do with the local plan update. I kind of wondered in terms of the timing of that, because obviously we just, council just approved the local plan update. So presumably it's going to be consulted on and then submitted. So do we have does this committee have any influence over that? Because I was hoping that we would have, challenging targets for developers in terms of, energy usage, etc., and whether we would be able to influence that and make sure it's as stringent as possible. or are we just going to see what's being presented and actually be able to do no changes to it?
Don't know what the intent was. Neil, can you remember?
I think it will be an update on what's in the local plan update in terms of the climate emergency impacts. And then, as always, the committee can make recommendations for officers to consider and the executive to consider.
I think overall the aim was that, you know, we have a theme of this session on the largest emitting sector in the borough, which is domestic emissions. So I think that's why we've got kind of obviously the retrofitting aspect, as in what's needed to bring existing the existing homes up to kind of climate friendly, and then we want to acknowledge the impact of new development. I think PTE raised it last meeting in terms of ensuring that we're not ignoring potential higher emissions from new development or new emissions from new developments to go into that domestic bucket.
Yeah, I kind of, I understand why we're doing it. I'm just questioning the timing because it's November and we're submitting the local plan update and it's being signed off, and whether we would actually be able to make any changes. I suspect not.
We're going to do it this year. It's going to be in some form of scrutiny and review all the way through till the end of the year, isn't it? So, because it's going to go to a public examination after the consultation. So it's going to be sometime second half of 2025 before it will be accepted, and therefore to the inspector in January. Then I think it's many months, I think, of public examination. So.
Okay, right. So that's next time we'll be looking at homes, and then there's 7th of January is renewable energy generation. And the remaining CEAT priorities after that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good programme. Thank you, Neil. I think it reflects accurately what we discussed at the first meeting.
When we look at the question, when we look at the ecological emergency, are we just looking at climate change, or are we looking more broadly? I mean,
sorry, I'm not quite sure what you meant.
Well, in January it says it says item ecological emergency to follow WBC's actions. It's just clarification, really. Are we looking beyond just climate change, getting warmer, etc.? Are we looking at the environmental aspects in terms of things like insect life, wildlife in the borough, such as there may be?
So, my suggestion, I requested or asked the question of, is this something this group should be looking at? Because, you know, since we have fairly recently declared this ecological emergency, this feels like the natural forum, as in across the oversight and scrutiny committees, to look at it. So I guess my expectation was broader, but that I hope there'll be quite a lot of overlap. But I'm open to feedback and guidance from all corners as to whether that's suitable. But I don't believe it's being looked at anywhere else, and perhaps that's something we can help bring a bit of kind of action, because it's almost at an earlier stage than the climate emergency that's been declared at an earlier stage.
I sit on the Constitutional Review Working Group, and I happen to know that they are looking at the scope of each of the overview and scrutiny committees, because it's not very finely balanced. So it may be that this forms part of that, that you make a recommendation to the overview scrutiny management committee to get this scope increased. That's just perhaps a suggestion.
Thank you. That makes sense.
I just realised I ought to go back to the previous item and thank the officers for making all the presentations and answering all the difficult questions. The action tracker, the final page. So, climate emergency business engagement and green skills, further updated 6 months. Isn't that about now?
We've put that on for the February meeting as part of the other aspects, just as a wrap up.
Okay. Looks okay to me.
That case.
In that case, we can go home. Thank you.